So with Wesfarmers offloading its OAMs division for just over $1 billion, it raises the question whether or not it should stay a conglomerate. I'm joined by Stephen Bartholomew from Business Spectator. Is it no longer a conglomerate, Wesfarmers, or will it become just a retail company?
It's less of a conglomerate than it's ever been. The success of the Coles acquisitions, because there's a number of brands in that group, has meant that retail's now easily the biggest part of Wesfarmers. Having sold out of insurance businesses, because they sold the insurance underwriting business to IAG late last year, they've got $3 billion of cash. They've taken over $1 billion of profit out of those insurance sales. They've got a balance sheet which has got relatively low levels of net debt compared to the asset base. They've got divisions which now look undersized. So you've got coal, obviously, which is not doing that great at the moment. You've got industrial and safety, and you've got chemicals, and they're all relatively small businesses in the scheme of Wesfarmers today. So you'd assume, we know, that there's a lot of soul searching going on inside to work out what they do next.
That Coles deal at $19 billion was transformative for the company. You'd imagine if they're going to do another deal, it has to be of a similar size, and given their balance sheet is so strong, they'd be unlikely to find a deal of that size in Australia. So surely offshore is the next place to go?
They've, again, traditionally had an aversion to doing things offshore. Because you need a different sort of skill set and understandings to operate at distance from the home base. It wouldn't be the least surprising if they did something large within Australia, but completely different to anything they've done previously, because that's their history. The deals they've traditionally looked at have been very large, transforming, risky. They backed themselves to make them work, and the Coles was, I suppose, a classic example of that, because as you say, it was a $19 billion deal. It was a massive risk-taking deal for Wes, and they've pulled it off. So who knows? I mean, it could be a bid for Woodside or something equally kind of radical. But within a conglomerate, of course, nothing's radical. Everything's open. So
are there deals of that size available in Australia? I mean, Woodside's an interesting example, but I mean, is there a few underperforming companies that fall in that $20 to $30 billion price range?
There'd be a few which may not be underperforming, where they might see long-term strategic gain. There are some obvious things in retail floating around at the moment. A couple of department stores, if they were minded to expand their interests there. I think McLeod's interesting because he actually, as you say, he's had an extensive career offshore, mainly in Europe. He's just gone onto the board of a Middle Eastern retailer, and some of those skills are actually transferable. Running supermarkets, there's a basic discipline to them, and coming out of that UK environment where they're actually very sophisticated, those skills might be transferable somewhere else in the region. But again, if they go more deep into retail, then they cease to be a conglomerate, and they do pride themselves on being a conglomerate.
So the last thing they could do with that money, of course, as you mentioned earlier, was to give it back to shareholders. Would that be a wise thing for them to do in this current environment?
Shareholders would probably think it was. Shareholders at the moment demand returns of capital and special dividends and so on and so forth. I think you've got this interesting environment where equity is actually pricey because people have chased equity returns in the absence of anything else. Debt is historically really cheap, and the smart thing to do in a kind of an economic sense would be to gear up and issue equity to make a really big acquisition at this point in time. Against that, the environment is kind of risky and studded with question marks, globally and locally. Locally, the outlook is for relatively slow economic growth for quite some time. So do you really want to take a lot of debt on and issue equity and gear up against a sluggish economy? And globally, of course, there's still question marks about the strength and nature of the US recovery. There's big question marks still about the stability of Europe. China's slowing. So is that the environment where you take a risk? Well, Wesfarmers has shown an appetite for taking risk throughout its history, so it's possible that they might say, well, it's a straw hats and winter strategy, while everyone else is risk conscious, will be risk averse. We'll have an appetite for risk and do something spectacular. But it will be one of the stories of this year, what they do next.
We'll have to keep an eye out for it. Stephen Bartholomew, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jackson.